All right, let's get into the games, and we'll have a menu out here. This is where I wanted to start with Matt and Tia because I thought that was just the biggest story of the weekend. But I'm going to let you chime in on that. Let's see what the top thing at the top of your head was.
So it's funny because I heard a lot of, oh my gosh, it was so boring. It's like
okay,
Matt and Tia just like completely ran away with it, and there was like no chance. And I think not only is it a little bit disrespectful to Matt and Tia's performance, but I think it's also a little bit disrespectful. And I'm not saying they're doing it to be disrespectful, but I think it's missing the point of what actually happened throughout in each individual event. I think it's people are taking the 10,000-foot view of like they won by a record margin, they won all these events, and they're missing the sum of the parts here in that every single event, there was an athlete that came out and went for him. Like, came out for blood, took their best swing. You know, it's like, you call it a puncher's chance in fighting, right? Like, you got a puncher's chance, and you get desperate, and you start throwing some haymakers, and you try to land that shot that ends it. And it felt like every event, when you go back and watch, there was at least one athlete that tried to make and put some pressure on each one of them. And then each event and every stop along the way, they fought them back, they fought them off, and they were incredibly successful on it. So I think that's a testament to both, the other four remaining athletes that did a tremendous job and deserved to be there and really tried to not just lay down and let Matt and Tia walk all over them. And then to Matt and Tia to take those blows, you know, stick and move and then keep pressing forward and then do so with a historic level of precision and performance that, I'll say this right now, I don't think we'll ever see as perfect of a performance in air quotes at the games as we will see here.
Yeah.
You look at Matt winning 10 of 12. You look at, I think Tia won 9 of 12, 8 of 12. It's like you just won't get that. And then some of it's the format, some of it's how purely good they are, and the fact that they earned that right to showcase it in this format as well. And I think people are just kind of like brushing it off, like, oh my gosh, you missed out on it,
yeah.
and they're missing, and they're not taking the time to actually stop, look at it, roll it around a little bit to see it from all angles, and actually be able to appreciate what it is. And you hear that conversation a ton when anytime you have all-time greatness persisting over time, like, oh, our dynasty's good for the sport. Is dominance at this level good for the sport? And then a couple years down the road, everybody looks back and they're like, oh man, remember when Jordan was killing it?
Yeah.
Remember when Tiger Woods was doing great? Like, remember Serena at her prime? Remember like this, and this? And they're like, man, I would give anything to watch that again. And it's almost like we get so caught up on like looking forward or looking backwards that we don't appreciate the present. And like we're witnessing something that honestly I didn't think would happen right after the Rich Froning era.
No way.
And I would have lost all my money betting on that, but we have it here now, and it might be a while till we see something like that again, especially if they continue it. And right now we're at the peak of it.
Yeah.
We get to watch the tip of the spear of what's possible. We're watching. If you talk about relative performance, if we're talking absolute performance, we're talking the absolute peak of fitness in terms of performance right now. And 10 years down the line, 10 years ago, people would have died to be able to see this.
I think 10 years ago this was unfathomable.
Yeah.
You know, you check out the weights that they're lifting and the times that they're putting up and the variety of things that they're able to do extremely well. But I'm glad you brought this up because you and I talked a little bit about this on Sunday night. I had the thought, and this was when I was doing the CBS show, because that was for an audience that obviously included a lot of CrossFitters, but maybe people who didn't know a whole lot about it. And I had the thought during this whole thing is what Matt and Tia are doing right now, is that good for the sport, good for the growth, and good for getting people excited about it? And I think there's two ways of looking at this. I think you can look at it short term, and then the brief conversation I had with you made me realize you have to look at it long term as well. I think in the short term, I'm not sure it is good for the sport. From a getting more people interested. Because if you just tuned into CrossFit for the first time on Saturday, you saw Matt Fraser and Tia Toomey beat the living hell out of everybody out there. And if you're just sort of John Q. Public who doesn't know a whole lot about CrossFit, you just assume, well, this doesn't look that hard because that guy made it look really easy, and these other guys must not be even close to his level. That's not fair because, like you said, everyone there is extremely fit. I mean, you're talking about the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg, and then Matt and Tia are just the ones who have been touched by the gods, and they're just that much better. But I feel like if that's the show that we're putting on, and it wasn't even close, it's hard for your everyday fan to watch 2 events and then want to find out more about that. It's like, oh, that was a pretty cool thing. I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to play devil's advocate a little bit in that if I'm a fan that doesn't know anything about the sport, I think pure star power trumps anything else.
Okay.
So it's like if I don't really know about fitness, but I turn on the TV and I'm like, what is this? And I see all these athletes doing it, and I see this one guy and this one girl that are training partners, and then you get the storytelling like this is basically the Michael Jordan of the sport. You're like, oh wow, that's kind of cool. I may be a fan of that person maybe rather than the sport, because I think there are multiple ways to get into it. You can be intrigued by the sport. You can be intrigued by an athlete. You know, there are people that are huge fans of LeBron James, of Patrick Mahomes, that have never thrown a football or shot a basketball in their life. And I think as a result, that in turn makes them fans of that particular sport because they like seeing excellence personified in those athletes. And I think it's possible, and this is, and I actually think these aren't mutually exclusive. I think both of these can be true. I think for people that are maybe have some familiarity with the methodology and then tune into the sport, maybe they're like, oh, well, I know this isn't easy. He's blowing all of them away. Maybe that turns me off a little bit. But I think for the people that maybe turn on CBS and they're like, oh, wow, this is Michael Jordan in his prime. This is the guy that's like the fittest man on earth, and he's just blowing everybody away. Wow, he makes it look so easy. I wonder if I should try that. It's almost like you take that extreme barrier away from some of those casual fans that maybe are intimidated by it at first. And I think you couple that with the messaging in between the events, which we'll get to in a little bit. I think that's one avenue for people to get in, because we've been told by so many people that they saw the documentary, they saw us on CBS a couple years ago, and that was their introduction into the sport and into the methodology. And it's I think for the people that are looking to get the fitness that get into things by being intrigued by the tip of the spear first and then work backwards, I think this isn't going to hurt it. I think for the people that are generally cautious no matter what, and maybe always look to like the most distilled version and then look up, maybe that might not be the best thing. But I'm really curious to see 3-4 years down the line what the impact is.
And that's where I think you get into the long-term thing. And I think that you mentioned Michael Jordan. And I remember as a kid, I wasn't a huge basketball fan. Didn't really watch it. Growing up, Sacramento didn't have a team until '85, and then we got one, and they were terrible. But I had a Michael Jordan poster in my room because I knew that he was the guy, and he made me kind of a little more interested in basketball. So I think long term, I think you're absolutely right. When you look at people who love greatness and want to watch it, Matt and Tia can be sort of that entryway for them. And then you have kids who are getting into CrossFit who will grow up idolizing them, who now want to be like them, and they want to compete. And that's great for the sport because we get more high-level competitors. You get a bigger field and makes it more competitive. All for that. So I think that's long-term. I think it is somewhat positive. But the short-term aspect of it, this is what concerns me, is that we were talking about greatest individual sports performances of all time as a group when we were doing the broadcast. And you talk about Wilt Chamberlain scoring 100 points in a game. There was Secretariat in 1973 winning the Belmont Stakes by 31 lengths. What's another one? I think Reggie Jackson had 3 home runs in a World Series game.
Tiger Woods
win the U.S. Open by 15 strokes.
Being a multi-day event.
Yep.
I think the Tiger Slam is similar career-wise as far as like sheer dominance at a particular moment in time.
Kobe's 81.
81, yeah.
Michael Phelps with the 8 gold medals. The thing is though that it's not. They did that once. Matt Fraser has done this every year essentially since he started winning the games. He has had it wrapped up every year before the final event. And this year, I think he had it wrapped up before the final day. Like he could have taken a 0 in the rest of those events on the final day, and called it and won. He didn't have to do anything, and he took it easy during the final event and still won it.
Yeah.
So those other accomplishments were so great because they rarely happen. What we're watching with Matt and Tia, they're going to win next year if they compete. No one is going to beat them because this sport is not set up to be conducive to upsets because it is all about your fitness. There is nothing that Noah or Justin or Sam can do to help blunt Matt's fitness. They can't play defense. They can't come up with a game plan. He's just better than everybody.
And they're not going to magically have something that wasn't already there to begin with.
Right.
Like, the elements of luck are much more muted, like you can huck up a half quarter, you can throw up a Hail Mary, and sometimes the ball just bounces your way. And maybe there's some of that with programming, but for the most part, like those little elements of the game aren't as present. And one of the reasons that make I think about like these all-time great performances, right? Why I think it's ultimately going to be good in the long term is all of those performances reset the playing field, reset the board for what was possible within the sport, and that in turn drove the growth and baseline, the baseline proficiency of that sport at the professional level across the board. Michael Jordan, the last dance happened in 1998, and basically at his peak when he was dominating, that was the spurn for the Kevin Garnett's, the Trace McGrady's, the Vince Carter's, the Kobe Bryant's of the world, the Shaquille O'Neal's, the athletes that are looking at that guy, they're looking at the Magic Johnsons, the Larry Birds, the Bad Boy Pistons, and they're seeing this is what's possible in the game now. You can even go Dr. J, Dominique Wilkins, the guys that re-innovated the game, and I think that's what Matt and Tia are doing, the re-innovating at this point.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you have this entirely new style that was built off of that, and it's the same thing with the Kobe's and Kevin Garnett's and Tim Duncan's and all of that. And now you have the Luka Doncic is the Giannis Antetokounmpos that are like hybrids of all these different players, right? Because now they're like, oh, if all these different things are possible, I'm going to pick my style a la carte from all of that. And I think that you're going to see that. Like, Matt has all of these skills now. Now I know what is required for me to be at that point. And I think we're already seeing glimpses of that with Haley Adams and with Justin Medeiros. And I think it's even more impressive now that, we talk about like records in terms of like Annie and Ben doing it very young. But it's even more impressive now knowing what the baseline is just to get to the games at this young of an age. And I think we'll start to see the young athletes coming up that are idolizing Matt, that are idolizing Tia, idolizing Katrin and Noah and Chandler and all these people, that the ceiling is just going to be so much more high. And I that's not a short, like you said, that's not a short-term result. And that's something that is on the responsibility for people like us to continue to tell those stories and cultivate that idea, those concepts around the sport so that it can flourish.
And I think that you made a really good point about Tiger Woods. Like, he did sort of drag everybody else up with him. The problem with what's going on right now is that gap is not narrowing.
Yeah.
Like, we saw it with the champions in the past with Rich. The gap started to narrow a little bit to where he was really had to work for that fourth one, and still got it. But that was one of the most exciting games ever in 2014 because there was some doubt. People expected Rich to win, but he needed to put together a perfect Sunday to do it. And that's what made the excitement. Next year, when Matt and Tia show up, unless something drastic happens, they're going to win.
Yeah.
And I don't, like, a lot of people might not, you go through this whole season, it's like, oh, same thing. They blow everybody away. They've got it wrapped up by the end, the final event. I think one thing that helps sort of, and I don't want to say blunt that, but maybe help us focus on other things is a bigger field. Because when you think about the athletes who aren't in contention, but you think about great moments of the games that you remember that have nothing to do with who ultimately won. And you can go back to Cassidy Lance McWhorter lifting that last barbell when they told her to do it. You can some of the things Josh Bridges would do. Cody Anderson's lift that one year in the ladder. Like those little moments that stand out that really I think help focus your attention elsewhere and not just on the race for the podium, because that's really that's the only focus we had. We had one heat of 5 athletes, and there was really none of that stuff took place. And two, with a bigger field, you mentioned how there was someone taking a shot there.
Yeah,
maybe Matt and Tia win fewer events. They're still going to be dominant. They might finish second, third, or fourth.
Some of those
they might not win.
Some of those performances, I'm just like, I don't know who's going to beat you there.
Exactly. And you could a couple of these events, you could probably hand pick someone and put them in there and see. I think you could beat Matt in this event.
Yeah.
So once we get back to a bigger field, I think that's something that would help. But I just left going, man, it's like no one's winning. As long as they're in, no one's winning because no one's closing the gap. They're not getting any worse. They have such a crazy advantage of not only being able to train with each other, but all the resources they have to do it. Their lives are set up for one purpose: train, go to the games, and dominate, cash your check, and repeat. Like that's how it's all set up. And I don't know if there's anybody else who has that luxury.
Yeah.
Because, but I mean, it was incredible to watch. It deserves its due as two of the greatest individual performances of all time, especially overtime, because even in other sports, when greatness is established, like I said, the gap narrows. It's not narrowing.
Yeah.
It is getting wider.
Yeah.
And that's incredible for them. And as I told Bill and Chase, I hope we can look back on this one day and really appreciate it for how dominant it was, and also compare it legitimately to some of these other great performances that we've talked about.
Yeah, it's just crazy because they basically found the opposite gender version of each other in terms of like mindset and focus and determination and grit and all of these little things, and now they're just using it to like power themselves up all the way up the ladder and even put some distance between them. It's pretty crazy to see. I think Trey Johnson in the comments mentioned that the small field did allow for more in-depth storytelling about each one of those athletes. I do like that.
Yeah.
I don't. Last year when the cuts happened, I thought they should have kept at least 20 all the way through the end, and I think that allows for some of the. I think you can make the cut to the final day down to 20, and understand that the points will stay relatively the same. And now you can have some in-depth storytelling on the final day for some of the athletes, but and still keep some parity at least for some mix-ups on the leaderboard. Now, I mean, I still think overall the leaderboard worked out for the rest of the podium in terms of keeping athletes in the hunt, relatively speaking. So I still like the drama for the rest of the podium as well for a lot of these athletes that weren't matched.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, if you cover up the top spot and you look at what happened beneath them, that was an exciting race. I mean, every person, I think in both divisions, I'm not sure about the women. I know for the men, though, every person occupied every spot on the overall leaderboard at least once. They were all over the place.
Yeah.
And it was fun to watch. And, you had big swings in one event. And again, that was the way the points were set up. It wasn't like they changed throughout so you could manufacture something exciting.
Yeah.
Like that was cool. I think it went as planned. Of course, Matt and Tia just ran away with it.
Yeah. I mean, you look at stage 2, right? Like, so I'll look at the women first. So 2007 reload. I will say that Tia was pretty handily in first place through the first 2 events. The corn sack sprint in 2007 reload. Those were the most like drama-less races for her, relatively speaking. Haley was on her heels a little bit on the first event, which added some intrigue. Like, here's this young gun finishing second. So I think that occupied a little bit. CrossFit Total going back and forth with Brooke. The handstand sprint she didn't win. The ranch loop she didn't win. The toes to bar lunge event, Katrin came out swinging through the early rounds. She tracked down Katrin towards the end with the kettlebell thing, so she had to bring out some of the bag of tricks to be able to pull that out. The snatch speed triple was relatively straightforward because she was perfect through all 9 bars. Bike repeater, there's a handful of athletes that were close to her early on. Katrin was in front to start. Then Haley was right on her tail, and then if she eventually pulled away by like 15 seconds there. Happy Star, Brooke Wells shot her shot, came up a little bit short, and ultimately Carrie Pierce was the one that started to catch Tia towards the end, but Tia still won. Swimming stuff, it was back and forth. Tia didn't win every interval. Haley was putting them down on a couple. I think the format of that allowed for a little bit of parity in individual interval events as well. The sprint sled sprint, she was neck and neck with Brooke basically the entire way. Atalanta was a slightly different story because obviously she did it alongside Matt. But even still, like she smoothened out her pace and still passed a ton of people, including Haley Adams on the back end, who unfortunately tore her hand. So I mean, you look at each way. For the most part on the women's side, there are people giving their shot. On the men's side, I think it's even more pronounced because even from the start. Now, granted, he won and he paced himself accordingly to be able to make up for that. When Fraser missed his last jerk, and then Medeiros comes walking up, maybe the result doesn't necessarily dictate that it was closer. But even then, you're like, okay. And then Matt closes the door, obviously, and then you see Medeiros. It almost acts as a setup for Medeiros as a character and as a player in that because he maybe pushed a little bit. The corn sack sprint, him and Quant were going back and forth. Quant asked him permission to pass. Did you hear that?
No, I missed that.
So there's a little. I was talking to Marcin and Heber, and Samuel Quant came up behind Fraser and was like, "Excuse me, can I pass you?" And Fraser was like, "Yeah, go ahead." And like you see him pass Fraser at one point.
Kidding me? You don't ask permission; you get by the guy.
Oh man,
that is the most Sam Quant thing probably ever, right there. But
pardon me, good sir.
Yeah.
Would you see it sufficient for me to pass you? And then Fraser goes and passes him back on and gets the win there. I mean, CrossFit Total, him and Adler going head to head. Handstand sprint, him and Medeiros going head to head. Ranch trail loop, him and Medeiros going head to head through most of that until Matt pulls away. Toes to bar lunge, same exact situation for the women, but with Noah Olsen this time. Snatch speed triple, there was the banter between him and Adler. Bike repeater, it was him and Medeiros, then him and Adler came in. And then Happy Star, who was it that came out hot there? Medeiros came out hot there. Swimming stuff, Sam Quant wins that. Sprint sled sprint, that was
a great
pretty
race.
Close. I mean, that was like about as close as you're going to get. Between him and Sam Quant. And then Atalanta, remember, Matt wasn't the first one to go out for the run. Noah Olsen was the first one to go out for the run. And then Matt still got him on the run there. So, like, even though his pace was subdued, there were still athletes mixing it up at the top, almost kind of like, and here's my Avengers reference. It was basically the battle on Titan in Infinity War with Thanos and all of the different, with like,
where they
Iron
almost
Man,
got the
where
gauntlet.
They almost got the gauntlet. Each time they just like keep coming. He like throws a planet at Tony Stark and like, I mean,
guy threw a planet at me.
He even calls
it aggressive.
He even says he's like, he wiped my face with a planet.
Yeah.
I still think there was like drama in individual events where you're like, oh, is this it? Nope. Oh, is this no? I mean, maybe people are kind of subdued by disappointment in that regard, by it not happening as much as you thought. But I still thought there were some people, and I look forward to next year with maybe slightly bigger fields because there are some athletes there, and then maybe there's some still ways to trim it on the last day to 20.
Yeah, I just think right now, I think I look back to the most exciting games that I've seen, and they all had some sort of mystery going into the final event.
Yeah.
Like there was that go back to 2017 with the women, the most exciting one ever. We're just not going to get that, at least for the top spot, until Matt and Tia decide they're done. And look, they're great for the sport. They're fantastic people. It's nothing, but they are just that much better than everybody. So I don't, if you're someone who really wants to see someone get challenged for the top, and that's why you're tuning into the games, you're going to be disappointed. But if we get back to a bigger field and you can root for people to make it to second and third, and then you can appreciate those little moments that we have in some of the earlier heats, then I think that's the focus isn't so much on the domination that we're seeing from Matt and Tia. It's more about it's back to where it was before. Because you can, like I said, you can pick out plenty of moments that in games past that had nothing to do with Matt and Tia that are still very memorable. It had no bearing on the championship race.